edge. Because you cut your under flap on the bias, you'll be able to stretch and match with the self fabric. So now that it's sewn, the cutting will be very important, the notching. So wherever it's round, you're going to do your V notch. Very deep V notch. It's going to help you to have nice corners. So I remove everything excess, and you're going to do a little understitch on the lining just at the bottom because of the style right now. So I'm gonna go sew right in the middle, understitch. Don't try to go too far, it's useless. Okay, so our next step is going to be to sew the welt on the garment. So one side of my welt has notches. I'm going to center my notch. That should be 1 centimeter further than the punch hole on each side. And I'm going to assemble at 5 millimeter from the notch. Very important to be accurate. So place your needle and do it by hand. Do your tacking by hand. So my notch is right here. Same thing on the other side. So I'll place the other flap right next to it, and I'm going to assemble at 5 millimeter also, starting exactly at the same place. Again, I'm starting very slow by hand. And finishing also by hand. Those are the most important seam. They're going to determine the width of your welt and the shape of your welt. Okay, so now you should be checking to see if your corners are square over there, and if your lines are parallel. That's going to determine your welt, like I was saying. And the next step, you turn it around and you cut the fabric only right on the first line that you trace. So you cut right on the line until the punch hole. And then you cut your ducktail. That means I'm flipping the welt and I'm going to cut from the punch hole to the last point of the seam, both sides. These are my ducktail. Again, the cutting is very important. You have to go all the way to the end of your stitch. So until punch hole and till the last point. So you pull a bit to make sure you see your thread, and you cut. Okay, so the next step is going to be to press this seam that we just did open. So you're going to turn the welt to get it on the other side and press each seam open. So seam open. And the second one, the seam open also. When this is done, you're going to fold your welt exactly the width of your fabric, both sides. Make sure they don't overlap and you don't have no gap. So I bring both of them over my open seam and you press your welt. Now you turn it around, and you could, at this point, you could fix the width of the welt. If they're not exactly the same, you could fix it by pulling your fabric or pushing your fabric. Keep the ducktail on top. We'll bring them in right at the next step. C'est bon? Okay, for the next step we're going to tack the ducktails. So from the top you push them in. You push them in. You pull a little bit on the fabric itself. And you're going to sew the ducktail. You don't have to go too far. It will do the same thing. Tacking up the ducktail. Same thing on the other side. Push it in and tack your little ducktail. Next step is going to be to close your welt. So one at a time, you have to do it twice. One at a time, you're going to lift and sew on the first seam we did, or a little smaller seam, not any bigger. So you're going to sew again. Both sides. That's going to close your welt. Now this one is closed, this one isn't. I could still pull it out. So I'm turning my fabric around, lift it, and sew. Same thing. I'm going to sew a little smaller or right on the same seam. Okay, so now I took my flap that I sewed before, all notch at the corner, and I turn it inside out and I press it, making sure that the lining is inside everywhere, because we cut the lining smaller. It should be really easier for you. And you're going to insert it between the two welts. and you're going to assemble it from the inside in the same seam or a millimeter smaller. What you should do to make sure your flap is going to stay on the right side is you could decide to sew it 0.5 higher than your fabric. So I'm sewing my flap. It's going to help your flap staying in place. So now my flap is sewn, it's attached to my pocket. I'm going to turn it around and assemble my. I will start with my big pocket bag, so the self fabric, and I'm going to sew it right on top, the top welt. So again, I'm going to align the pocket bag with my welt, and I'm going to sew on the same seam again, but this time from the beginning of the piece to the end. Same seam or a little smaller. I will attach my small pocket bag in lining, right side with right side, to the welt. Same thing that I just did. I align my pieces together, and I'm going to assemble from edge to edge in the same seam or a millimeter smaller. Whoops. Now you have both pocket bag. We should have about 2 centimeter seam allowance, but you could take only one and assemble the lining pocket bag to the self pocket bag. If they seem like they don't match perfectly, it doesn't matter, you should not pull. There you go, so your pocket is now finished. You could pull your flap back out and your welt pocket is finished.